who is not else but Uwe Friedrichsen, who is the CTO of Codecentric, and he's always in search of innovative ideas and concepts. His current focus areas are system design, deep learning, and the IT of tomorrow, or even further. You might have met him already in the craft because he had a workshop about getting API design right, and about his presentation. Bringing new ideas to your users in just a few hours sounds irrelevant to you? Deployment once a week is sufficient? So I think Uwe in this session will explain why these conceptions are wrong. Be prepared for some surprises and get ready for a speed boost. Please welcome on stage our next presenter, Uwe Friedrichsen, with his presentation, The Astonishing Value of Speed. Uwe, the stage is yours.
Thanks a lot for the great introduction. So, welcome everybody, and at least even if we can't be on the site ourselves, so I at least added a nice picture from the conference site to the beginning of my presentation. Everybody of you who was already at Craft on site probably will remember that view. So before we start, just 2 words of warning so that you can decide if you want to stay here or if you want to move on. First of all, usually that's a 60-minute talk. I've got 30 minutes. I'm not sure if I exactly will hit 30 minutes, but maybe 33 minutes or something like that. But even if I cut out quite a lot of it, it will be quite dense talk due to that time limitation. And the second thing is, this talk will be about the why going fast, not about the how. The how would be a lot longer than just 30 minutes or even 60 minutes. Fortunately, the how stuff is already available. So all the things we need for going really fast exists, and there were already workshops and a lot of sessions here at Craft Conference from other speakers to teach you about many of the details that you need to know. The problem is that there are still many companies who don't pick these ideas up because they don't understand the value of going fast. Why should you go fast? What's the benefit? And that's the gap I try to fill with this talk. Okay, as you already know, my name is Uwe Friedrichsen, and yeah, CTO of Codecentric was already mentioned. You find me on Twitter if you have a question that comes to your mind next week or somewhen, and you can ping me there. You can find my slides and speaker deck. I also write a little blog, and you find several of my ideas there. And here is the link to the blog, which discusses some of the idea I will also talk about in this presentation. So much about that. Jumping in, I say going fast. Going fast. What does that mean? So it is right, immediately raises a question. So what do I mean with going fast, and how fast is fast? Well, that's 2 questions. So let's start with the first one. What do I mean with going fast? And if you discuss going fast with people, most people only think about deployment frequency. So how often do they deploy to production? By the way, I only care about production because that's the place where software unfolds its value. So I don't care about a nice CI/CD pipeline into a dev stage or a test stage or something like that. So production. So is it once a week, once a month, every 3 months, or maybe every day and so on? So it's usually the discussion you have there. What not so many people think about is cycle time. So the time it takes from somebody, usually from a business department, having an idea through the whole IT value chain for implementing and testing it until it's deployed in production. The customer can sees it and can provide feedback to the originator of the idea, because that's the time, this cycle time is the time that you need to learn how good your ideas are. It's something very different. So we see a lot of organizations which have weekly deployments to production, but it still takes 6 months, 9 months, or even longer than a year due to the project overheads and settings until people get feedback for their ideas. So cycle times is still very long. So it's a big difference. And when I talk about fast, I talk about cycle times. Deployment frequency just must not come in the way. So deployment frequency, if you deploy once a month, your cycle times will most likely not be faster than a month. So it limits how fast you can go. Okay, that's what I mean with going fast. And how fast is fast? And when I talk about fast, I mean the delivery speed without compromising quality of the elite performance of the State of DevOps report. And if we look into that, they have 4 core metrics, top 2 ones about speed, the bottom 2 ones about quality, so to balance each other. And you see the deployment frequency up there, and you see the lead time for change. And at lead time for change, you see intraday, less than 1 day. So if you go in the fine print, you will read there, okay, time from commit to production. Actually, they were interested in the whole lead time from idea to production, but they had so much variance in the first part that it killed all their calculations and all their statistics, and therefore they use lead time for change this from commit to production as a proxy metric. That's something you might need to know about that. And if you say, wow, less intraday, that's a few unicorns only can do that. No, already in 2019 was the last time. That's when Nicole Forsgren, Jess Humble, and Gene Kim, the originators of the State of DevOps report, still were involved in the creating the report. 20% already were in elite performer section. And this is, there were several thousand companies involved. So there are quite some companies around the world who are that fast. So it's not magic, it exists, it's achievable. And then with that, you go to your average decision maker in a corporate. And what you get is, we don't need it. Deployment per week or per month is fine. And why should I care about cycle times now? I never cared about that anytime. So several months was good enough, always still good enough. And then I say, well, what about post-industrial markets? Post what? Well, post-industrial markets in the last 20 or 30 years, most markets changed dramatically in a way that the old paradigms we use for industrial production do not fit anymore, and we have to rethink the way we respond to the market and its needs. And actually, to unwrap that all would be at least half an hour, and therefore I just give you the gist version of that, which is, if you take industrial and post-industrial thinking next to each other, and you think about demand-supply ratio, and here's the big difference is, in industrial setting, always assumes that there's a lot more demand than supply. And post-industrial, the ratio reversed. So the supply is a lot higher than demand. And this had a lot of dramatic effects. And that's what we see in most places these days. So in an industrial market, the supplier dictates speed and what's happening and when it's happening and how often it's happening. The evolution of the market in a post-industrial setting is driven by consumers, by their needs. So they say how fast things have to evolve. The characteristics then that a producer, a supplier finds is wide and sluggish, industrial setting, so they can decide what to do when and so on, and very narrow and fast in post-industrial setting. Also, success certainty is very different. So if you provide something in industrial setting environment, it's very high because demand is high. So if you're not completely wrong, you will be successful with what you provide. So basically you can focus on creating it as cost efficient as possible and as much as possible, but speed doesn't matter so much because, again, you dictate the market. In a post-industrial setting, your certainty is very low because there's a lot more supply than demand. If I do not exactly nail the demands and the expectations of my customers, they're not going to buy, which also has effects on a refinancing period. I mean, in industrial setting, there's a long cash cow cycle where I can refinance my investments because I decide when the next release, the next software, the next product will be released. In a post-industrial setting, it's very, very short. Already when you release the product and you're still fighting for market share, the next product is already waiting to oust your current product. So you must start refinancing immediately, which is a very different story. And you really have to nail it, the product, in terms of expectation of customers to get it right. So it leads to very different strategies how to address these markets. I mean, while in industrial settings, cost efficiency and scale, optimizing for those two things was perfect. In a post-industrial setting, it doesn't help at all. You have to go for fast feedback and adaptability. So rings a bell, going fast feedback, right? But my decision maker then was, well, looks at me deadpan, said, and what does that have to do with IT? Let's talk about markets, not about IT. Say, well, it has to do a lot about that. And again, that would be half an hour story to discuss evolution of IT over the last 50 or 60 years, starting from commercial software development in the 50s over software crisis, software engineering, and the PC revolution, internet revolution, mobile phones, up to IoT and cloud and everything in these days. Again, just a version. Role of IT these days, very different from how it was in the past. It's a nervous system of any non-trivial business. So everything you do on the business side is encoded in IT. It's basically it's business DNA. Your IT is the business DNA. So shut down the IT and you will die within a day, 2 or 3. It's not only that, but also, meanwhile, often IT is the enabler of new business models. I mean, just think Uber, for instance. Try to imagine Uber without a mobile app and all the IT they have. Will be a hard thing. And you don't have to go to Uber. There are a lot of places where new business models are driven by IT. And then if we go to the digital transformation, I mean, in its core, digital transformation means that IT creeps into every aspect of business. So not just supporting business processes, but also going into the communication between customers and the company. And if we think about things like API-driven business, so whole revenue streams just going through IT with any human involved in that. So very different story meanwhile. And of course, we talked about feedback for post-industrial market. Our feedback, these days we collect our feedback via IT. So measuring how people use it, using social media channels and all that stuff. Putting that together, I mean, you cannot change anything in your business without touching IT these days. So it's not only that you need it for running your business, you also need, you can't change anything in your business, release any new product feature, anything like that, without touching IT, because that's your business DNA. So IT delimits how fast you can get feedback from your customers, how fast you can go. Or like I like to say it, these days, business and IT are the same side of the same coin. And the other side is the market. So if you're still talking about business IT alignment, you're doing it wrong. If you still treat your IT as a cost center, you haven't understood what's going on. Okay, coming back to the decision maker. And he draws his ultimate weapon or her ultimate weapon. But my market is not post-industrial. Leaning back, relaxed, giving me a grin. Saying, well, let's not discuss that if this claim is true or not. There are some places which are not post-industrial, but there are not many of them anymore. Most of them are. But even if it's not post-industrial your market, there's still huge value in going fast. I mean, let's go back to the State of DevOps report and look a little bit into the management summary here. Our highest performers are twice as likely to meet or exceed the organizational performance goals. That's quite a nice probability. Or here, productivity can drive improvements in work-life balance and reductions in burnout. That's a big one, actually, I think. Or here, drive speed and stability as well as reductions in burnout. Repeating pattern. So what they figured out basically is that shorter cycle times, so going really fast, does not lead to more stress and a lot of chaos and reduced performance, but quite the opposite, that it leads to a lot of less stress and higher performance. I mean, this alone should be worth aiming for short cycle times. Well, our decision maker, you said you reduce the probability of burnout. So if that person is not a complete psychopath, the person will not say, I don't care or anything like that. So, but at least still reluctant to change. So I'm still not convinced. Okay. Here are even more advantages. I mean, there's a lot in there that you don't even think about. I have 7 right here, which I will briefly touch, but I'm sure there are more than that. So let's start with a simple one. Cutting off manual tasks. If you really want to go fast intraday, you have to automate everything that you can automate. Every repetitive task needs to be automated. So leads to a high degree of automation. For some strange reasons, if people have time, even if they can save a lot of money, the companies don't invest in automation. They let the people repeat all the tasks over and over and over again until they really need to go faster. And then they make the investments, even if it would provide them with a lot of savings. But for some reason, they don't do it. So because probably it's quarterly thinking or something like that. So, but you have a lot of additional effects of rigorous automation because a lot less errors happen and the people are happier, a lot less repetitive tasks, and you have more capacity for valuable work. So you get more done with the same and even happier people, which means it saves money, improves productivity and robustness, which is nice. Number 1. Number 2, it helps you to simplify tasks, to cut the fat from your processes and organizations and everything. I mean, if you really want to go fast, if you really want to have short cycle times, it ruthlessly points out waste because you always see, oh, here's something which stops me from going faster. So it makes it visible, especially if some tasks have become an end in itself, if they don't add any value to the final product. So if you have bloated requirements validation processes which don't add a lot of value, or some complex design rules from the ivory tower, or the documentation without a reader, or. So if you're working such an organization, you probably will find a dozen of those things within a minute or something like that. Or so it shows a degree of autopoiesis, as Niklas Luhmann described that, sociologist. So would take another 10 minutes to describe autopoiesis, and it would be really interesting because this concept is very helpful to explain a lot of the dysfunctionalities of bigger organizations. Here, please, all people with such sociological background, forgive me for that very, very rough approximation. I would like to shrink it down to the degree of autopoiesis is the degree to which you, as an organization, are more occupied with yourself and your own needs and optimizing for your own desires and demands and needs than focusing on your original purpose that you started with to create value for your customers, be they internal or external. So it's about autopoiesis, a lot about self-justification. So the reason for existing, justifying the reason for existing, and self-occupation. And that's what you see here. So this becomes visible if you really want to go fast. And if you try to get faster then and get rid of that, it requires you to focus on value. I mean, whenever you hit something that prevents you from going faster, basically you need to ask the question, does it create value for the customer? At least if you're doing it right. And quite often the answer will be no. if you're honest. And this helps you to figure out everything that doesn't create value, which is self-occupation. So it leads to simpler processes, to less useless procedures, happier people, by the way, and more focus on purpose and value and creating value, and brings you away from routines and habits, which again saves money, reduces stress, improves productivity if you're doing it right. Nice. Number 3, completely different perspective, configuration frenzy. Most enterprise systems have lots of configuration options. There are some business administrator who can change a lot, often hundreds and thousands on configuration settings with some front end that are specifically built for them, where they can set up, you name it. And all these options need to be handled in the code. So you have complex decision logic. How is this configuration parameter set? If this is like that, if that is like that, switch case, you name it. And multiple execution paths that all need to be in there for all the possible options in there, which makes it a lot more complex. And then you have additional configuration options, the management front ends, which these admins use, and you need to handle the storage of all these options, and you need the access logic and how to make sure that these are read if they're changed at runtime. And sometimes that's up to 50% of the overall solution complexity. I've seen solutions that had more than 50% where all these what to do if some configuration parameter was set in some way. And this, of course, adds complexity. And this comes at a price. I mean, code is harder to read, to understand, to test, to debug. We all know that. It becomes slower to change and more expensive. Bugs creep in, robustness in operations go down, and all that stuff, all these nasty effects. And most of the options, not all of them, but most of them are needed only due to our long lead times. I mean, someone in business comes along and says, oh, wow, there's something happened and we have to change the behavior of our system in the following way. How long does it take IT? And IT answers, yeah, well, current release is full, so in 15 months. And say, well, we have a week, 15 months. Okay, build us a configuration option for that. So if we come along the next time. And so configurations come in and get more and more. Now, think if your lead times were shorter than the needed time span. So they come to you again, say, well, we need that change in behavior. How long does it take? Well, tomorrow. Oh yeah, that's great. We expect it in a week. Well, tomorrow, no problem. Or it's really urgent. We need that this afternoon. And oh, well, okay, we stash our current work, half an hour. Completely different story right now. So most of your configuration options you do not need anymore. You just put a ticket out there to IT and yeah, they implement it, done, fast enough. So you save a lot of time and money, you get simpler solutions and improves robustness and production and happier developers. Well, again, you don't get rid of all the things, but a lot of the configuration options will just vanish. You see, it's another point of view, number 4, which is again very different, project overheads. And these long lead times that we have here, so for creating a new release leads to a huge backlog. When whole IT is busy with doing these long 1 year lasting or 6 months lasting projects, and there are already some more projects back in the pipeline. And it's not that business just sits there like, well, your market evolved, they have new ideas, all that stuff, they need to respond. So a lot of requests pile up while IT is working on this ongoing project. And a simple queue, so this pile becomes so big that a simple queue is no longer enough to manage all the requests. So we need a more complex organization to handle all these queued up and piled up requests. And typically what we do for many years is then we create a project organization. So we bundle all the requests in different projects, we define them, we budget them, we prioritize, approve them, we set them up and staff them, we implement them, control them, readjust them, a whole big complex organization on top of the organizational structure that we set up here, which creates lots of additional efforts. So which means a project must have a certain minimum size because it's so expensive to set up a project. That usually the projects create a reinforcing loop that big projects create even bigger projects, and so you're getting slower and slower and slower over time. Again, what if we could implement our requests so fast, again, intraday, that there is not a big backlog. There's just a day or two piled up. That's it. So if you're fast enough for that, I mean, this would dramatically reduce that huge backlog, and you would be able to get along with a much simpler organization. I mean, so idealized. So imagine such a big Kanban board for all the requests that come in, and there's not a lot which will pile up on the left side because you're all the time working on that, and you wouldn't need that complex project organization. It would simply vanish, would go away. So your normal regular organizational structure is sufficient to handle that. Just some cross-functional teams and you're fine. Business owners would be a lot more relaxed because they know they don't have to wait for a year or two or more, but just maybe a week maximum until their request is implemented. And IT would be more relaxed because it's not that everybody comes along all the time, oh, you're too slow and everything. So yeah, and even stable teams are possible with that. Okay, again, it's not that simple to set up such an organization with just a simple Kanban board, but it's quite straightforward. Again, yeah, saves money, makes you faster, reduces stress. You already see, so there are effects in there that you wouldn't have thought about when you just think about going faster. Number 5, no emergency task forces needed anymore. I mean, typically in these huge project organizations, you have this separation between project and maintenance. Projects, implementing the new stuff, big, new, long-running projects, we talked about that. And then after they're done, they hand it over to maintenance and they take care of the bugs and the small changes, and yeah, usually more working with a ticketing system or something like that. And an unwritten rule of law is that the most experienced engineers go to the projects because nobody wants to do maintenance. So everybody wants to do project because that's where the cool stuff happens. And now imagine serious production error occurs. Well, you know, the experienced engineers are in the project, so usually they cannot fix the serious ones. And so they set up an emergency task force, which is pulling all the experienced people from the running projects and setting up an emergency project organization on top of a project organization on top of your organizational structure. Well, and often these run for days, and often many companies need them more often than they dare to admit. And while they're running, they have a significant productivity loss, because if you take the most experienced person from one of these running projects, your productivity will usually go down by 50% or more, usually more. So basically your complex organization structure basically stands still while this emerging task force is running. A lot of stress, productivity loss. So with intraday cycle times, well, you have these cross-functional teams. Somewhere something blows up. The teams responsible for that part of the system says, oh, there's something blowing up. Well, it's a priority 1 error. Okay, let's stash what we're currently doing and do this swarm around this error, fix that, and then move on with the next stuff. Everybody else still working, so nothing happening there. And yeah, it's just another task. And if it's a priority 2 or lower error, you can just sort it into your usual line. So again, saves money, stress, all that. Okay, we're getting closer. Number 6, less workload work. Another perspective. With these long lead times, most of the code is not used. I mean, there were some studies which said, yeah, 20% are frequently used, 30% rarely used, 50% usually not used at all, or even disliked by the users. And the reason for that is that there's some poor person, requirements engineer, somebody who have to guess what's needed in 1 year's time without having any access to the users usually. And then also the different departments only have one shot, because there's so many projects always waiting for IT capacity, that they have one shot in 2 or 3 years. So they try to cram everything into that one project that could maybe be used in 1 year's time. I mean, I'm surprised that the numbers are still that good with that. Now, assume an organization with intraday cycle times. Well, with that, oh, I've got a new idea. It's 10 o'clock in the morning. Let's go over there. Here's a new idea I have. Here's the smallest thing that we could implement that I could learn if this is valuable or not. Okay, come back at 3 o'clock, and then we look at the metrics that we have collected so far then. Well, you can learn within a day if something is useful or not, and not by asking some strange people or something, but from your users, from your customers. So you can immediately identify and cut off non-successful features, and you can work with much smaller teams. You can produce a lot less code. You get simpler systems. You're even able to outsmart the demographic change. Well, cool. Okay, last one before I will wrap up here, because now I'm hitting about the 30 minutes limit. So we have all these in management. So in higher management levels, they always talk about we need improved business agility and all that. And they always forget that the effects of this digital transformation, that IT and business are the same side of the same coin. So they talk about business agility and still handle their IT as a cost center. And well, doesn't work that way. I mean, we've seen it. IT delimits the speed and the flexibility of your business agility. So if you have the intraday lead times, now you have the prerequisite for your great business agility. Well, so still think that you don't need it? Okay, let's wrap up. What are the effects of going fast so far? I mean, there are a lot more things that we could figure out. These were just 7 perspectives and a lot more perspectives. First one, we need it for highly dynamic post-industrial markets to have the fast feedback loops to learn from the users. It can give us a significant cost savings. It helps us to create simpler, more effective organization. It improves our productivity. It increases the robustness of our entire IT landscape. It helps to simplify the IT landscape and makes it more robust this way. It leads to higher employee satisfactions with all the positive effect, lower churn rates, lower burnout, all that stuff. The resilience of the company increases in terms of if something unexpected happens. We don't even need COVID for that. It's just something, a competitor comes up with something, I can respond a lot faster. I get my business agility. I get higher customer and user satisfaction if played right. And we have a relief for this omnipresent shortage of IT experts because we can get done more with less people, and. So from my point of view, there's no sensible alternative to going fast. Again, as I said, this was about the why, not about the how. That would be a longer story. I would be happy to discuss that at some other time with you. But I hope I gave you a little bit of purpose, a little bit of motivation, why it really makes sense to go fast for intraday lead times and cycle times. Thanks a lot for your time. That's what I had. And now I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Uwe, for this great presentation. Let's see about the questions. We have actually 2 of them at the moment. So the first one is quite interesting. I think it relates to the part which takes a longer time, but let's see. Have you ever given this talk to decision makers, and what was the result?
I've given this talk, or at least parts of, not this talk, but I discussed this idea of post-industrial markets and the evolution of IT quite often with decision makers. And it has interesting effects in some ways. So quite often it was that way. I talked to a CIO or some people like that, and some person like that. and then said, well, yeah, there's a lot of truth in there. And then there are two possible outcomes. The first one is about 3 or 6 months that it takes to sink in and trickle down a little bit. They come back and say, hey, what can we do to implement that? Or the other one is the high-level decision makers are aware that this is really useful. And then we have this middle and lower management level, which tries to not, or let's say, which tries not to have any changes to the current situation because that they think that could be dangerous for their, rising up the career ladder, or riding up the career ladder. So change is always a threat to them, and then it dies. So it depends a lot. But most people say, yeah, well, there is definitely a point in that. When I started with that in 2013, it was a different story. But meanwhile, well, yeah, nobody says no, nothing's going on. Still, long way to go.
That there are good results. Let's see the next question. Does faster commit to production time still have value when the idea to commit time gets longer?
Does faster commit to production time still have value?
To production time still have a value when the idea to commit times gets longer?
Okay. Does faster commit to production time? I personally think it still has value in terms that it's an enablement. You're creating a prerequisite for changing something in front of that. I mean, as long as your commit to production lead times are, let's say, a month or 2 or 3, why should I change from the idea to the commit my lead times? Because it slows down at the end anyway. And therefore, I think it really has some value to have that in place to say we can deploy on demand. And by the way, it gives you also inside IT a lot of more options to make more internal experiments, to check out things, to due to the high degree of automation that you will have, to have sleep better when you deploy, that you don't need to deploy anymore on the weekend, but that you deploy whenever you like. So there's this high trust in that things will go right. And this alone has a value. But again, I think you need to commit to the production lead times to have them short to create some pressure on the first time, on the first part of the value chain. That's yes, has some value.
Okay, the next question is actually mine. So you pretty much described the situation what we have in our project. So, but not on the good side, but mostly on the old side. And therefore, I will ask you about the how as well, separately. I would like to ask you that what do you think the industry itself, so like in industrial automation, will become a post-industrial at the moment, because they do not really want to do an update to stop production and doing updates regularly. They want to do it very in a frequent base, so maybe yearly or 2 times a year. And this causes a lot of trouble.
And I'm not sure where I missed a piece of the. So, what's the question again in this setting?
It's the post-industrial part that the industry itself, we're working in the industry, in the production lines.
Okay.
Will this become also post-industrial, or is it already, in your opinion?
So when I talk about industrial and post-industrial, I do not necessarily talk about what the companies produce, but the market dynamics, how they are. And in most most domains, the market dynamics have changed in the last 20, 30 or 40 years, depending in which market you are in. For instance, if you are going to retail, it's a survival of the fittest, definitely. If you go to most real production industries, they started to learn these lessons about 30 years ago or 40 years ago, that they have to change and adapt in ways how they produce things, that they went down to batch size 20 years ago or something like that. What most of them didn't realize is that IT, meanwhile, is the same thing as business. And so that this has become inseparable. So whatever you do to IT, you do to business and vice versa in some way. And you can't separate these two things anymore. And this is the lesson most companies still have to learn. I mean, we have a few islands of the blissful who, due to some influences, monopoly, lobbyism, so regulations and all that stuff, have created a non-efficient market where they still can dictate their speed of moving a little bit. But also here, the water level is rising from what I observe. And it's mostly a matter of time, I think. Not sure how long the time will be. But again, the key problem is that most people have not yet understood this inseparability of business and IT these days, and that this digital transformation brings it closer and closer and closer together and makes it completely indistinguishable from each other. I mean, that's the key of digital transformation. Most people don't get that.
Okay, thanks. We still have one question. Let's see. My experience is that a lot of projects take long because they have to be done in a legacy code base. Any suggestions on first steps to take on increasing speed in low quality environments?
Oh, that's where I usually hand over to Michael Feathers, working with legacy software. And to be honest, I don't think that I could provide any better idea than he does in his book. And therefore, I would simply recommend, read his book or ping him. I think he's not here this time on Craft, but maybe it would be a good idea to invite him for next year or something like that, to have him here. I mean, it's everything said about that, so make it testable in some way. The biggest problem is not the code base itself, it's to get the time usually to change something about the situation. So if, for instance, if you go to the original ideas of DevOps, so not this simple CI/CD part, which it turned into over time, but these original ideas of creating faster IT value chain, so reducing lead times or cycle times. And they had this one principle, there are 3 principles, and the third principle was then reserve 20% of your cycles for improving what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And the biggest problem is probably to get these 20% to improve what you're doing. And well, it's possible, but you have to set up some kind of business case. And I think it's calculatable, that business case. But again, that would be a longer story. But still, coming back to the original recommendation, start with the book of Michael Feathers. He did a great job with that one.
Yeah, Michael said last time when I saw him that it is always popular. So he wrote this book long time ago, but it's still very popular, and it will be for the future, I think. Thank you very much, Uwe. So we run out of questions.